If there's a video I think I'd like to see a video on homebrew creature design, determining abilities, actions, AC, CR, etc.
2 months ago, HithertoBrew received a message from the individual known only as codename C Von Rats. After careful analysis, it appeared to contain a request for a video covering a specific topic. That topic? Creatures. This is that video. Viewer discretion advised. Homebrewing creatures in your games encompasses a lot of the lessons that we've learned already in this series and brings them all together, so this seems like a good time to address the Baron Von Rat's request. Much like any other homebrew for TTRPGs, the process can be quite simple or really quite complicated, depending on what your goal is. For instance, I recently made a Siren type creature for a game that I'm currently running. By the way, if you're watching this and you're one of my players, then, don't worry about it, it's for something else. The fact that you're in the middle of a seafaring adventure while I happen to be making these creatures, purely coincidental. So don't worry about it, it's fine. Anyway, I didn't want to put in a ton of effort to make a Siren when in the Dungeons & Dragons monster manual there already existed all of the components that I would need to make one. The Harpy is a CR1 monster with all of the classic elements you'd expect, and importantly for me, the luring song ability that charms creatures who fail the saving throw to resist the effect. Now, the Harpy isn't quite hardcore enough for my players who are a level 13 party at the moment, so I instead lifted the ability from the Harpy Matriarch from Ghosts of Saltmarsh, which is CR5. It also has this cool ability called Visage of Desire, which causes targets to envision themselves achieving their greatest desires and become paralyzed. This fit my theme, so I'm taking that too. I could have just taken the Harpy Matriarch, slapped a swim speed on it and called it a Siren. Totally fine, that's creature homebrew. I went just one more step on this occasion because I wanted my Sirens to present a bit more of a threat to my party and their crew. Or, any party, not necessarily the party in my game. So Sirens are pretty much mermaid harpies, right? The monster manual also contains a stat block for merfolk, but they're just challenge 1/8. That's a dog. Be quiet, dog. You're ruining my video. Mero, on the other hand, are a little bit more chonky and suit my needs perfectly. They are still just CR2, but as they don't have any fancy abilities like Luring Song or a fly speed, their base stats, health, and melee attacks pack a bit more of a punch. So I ended up taking the Mero, giving it the Luring Song ability and the Visage of Desire. I decided I didn't really need a fly speed for the encounter that I had planned, so I left its movement as it was. Nonetheless, with the extra health and hitting power, our wingless Harpy Matriarch is probably a little bit more threatening than before, so I estimated it at about a CR6 when determining the difficulty of the encounter. All in all, a very simple exercise and definitely something I would encourage you to do whenever you can get away with it. If you remember back when we were working on Yorick from League to create items, spells, and a subclass, I mentioned that it was important to consider first what the core element of your inspiration is going to be and build out from there. The exact same thing applies here. In the example I just gave of a Siren, what's the first thing that you think of? Their song, right? That's the most important element of a Siren, and we already have exactly that ability in the game, in this case D&D. The only thing that really makes it a Siren instead of a Harpy is that it's an aquatic creature, right? So that's easy. But what about if we're feeling a bit more adventurous and we want to create a monster that doesn't really already exist in the monster manual? Let's look at 2 examples of classic monsters and see how we might build them in D&D 5e. First, let's go with something that everyone knows, Godzilla. What's the thing that makes Godzilla Godzilla? Well, there have been a few different versions, but let's say his atomic breath ability is something we definitely want to include. He's also hella big, so we need to remember that. So the first thing coming to mind for me is another classic monster that definitely does exist in the monster manual, a dragon. We've got several stat blocks for dragons of different challenge ratings and with various abilities. That's probably a good place to start looking for a baseline. We could definitely get away with describing Godzilla as a sort of wingless Nuke dragon. It's a good name for a band, actually. I spent way too long on that. I'm not spending a huge amount of time on this, so let's have a look at an adult red dragon. That seems vaguely appropriate. We could easily modify the fire breath to be atomic fire. I think I would either make the damage radiant or necrotic, or maybe even split the damage between one of those and fire damage. Now Godzilla is obviously pretty imposing, and this dragon already has the frightful presence ability, so we can take that as well. Godzilla can't fly, obviously, so that's something that we'll get rid of. This dragon is also huge in size, but gargantuan might be more appropriate for Godzilla. So now what I like to do is create a list of all the things that we are keeping from the red dragon in one column, and all of the things that we are either changing or getting rid of entirely in another column. So here are the things that we're keeping. We're keeping the breath attack, most of the stats, the frightful presence ability, the bite attack, the claw attack, the tail attack, and we would probably want to have some legendary actions as well. Things that we would either get rid of or change, we would obviously get rid of the fly speed, and of course along with that is the wing attack that the dragon has. Blind sight that dragons have, don't know of Godzilla having blind sight, so we would probably get rid of that. And the charisma for a red dragon is quite high. I don't necessarily think Godzilla is a particularly charismatic character. I could be wrong on that, but I'm inclined to probably get rid of the high charisma score as well and replace that with something a bit lower. This gives us a very quick impression of how well the dragon fits our goal. It looks like there's more here that we want to keep than change, so it's a pretty good fit. For each thing that we do change though, we want to be mindful of its power level. For example, if we take away the dragon's ability to fly, it's far less dangerous. Godzilla can swim, and if you plan for your encounter with him to take place at sea, giving him a swim speed instead of a fly speed might balance out. Otherwise, you might need to consider that the reduced mobility of the creature will bring the challenge rating down. Without wings to fly, he isn't going to have a wing attack, but we could give him something to replace this, maybe a stomp attack. We could even give it the exact same effect as the wing attack, which still fits the idea of a massive creature sort of stomping on the ground. And to compensate for his lack of mobility, we might want to give him more health or more armor, or both. I'm going to talk about challenge ratings and how to manage them in a follow-up video because there's a lot to consider and it's not really the most robust or intuitive of systems, so I think it probably warrants a bit of a longer discussion on that. By taking as much as we can from what already exists, that can help to make sure that our new creature isn't way too strong or way too weak, because we can try to approximate the threat level of the creatures that we use as a base. So Godzilla becomes a slightly reworked red dragon in this case. Not terribly exciting, but it works. Feel free to use that as your Tinder bio, by the way. Even if you aim to create something totally new and there's nothing at all like it in the monster manual or the source material that you're using, I still recommend referring to something as your baseline, if for no other reason than it saves you a lot of work. Okay, we're going to look at one more example, and this time I'm actually going to make it. I'm sure this has been done numerous times before, but let's make the Xenomorph from Alien. Starting as we always do, what are its most important characteristics? I've written here a list of some of the things that I considered. We've got its bitey tongue puncher, which is what I decided to call it, another good band name there. It's a pretty stealthy creature that uses that to its advantage when it's hunting. It has highly acidic blood that can corrode metal and other materials. It has a very slashy tail that it uses along with its claws as its primary means of attack. And yeah, obviously we've got its face hugger egg cycle thing. Okay, so the most obvious thing is its pneumatic drill tongue. So we want to give it a signature ability that is associated with that. I've already got something in mind actually that we're going to borrow from our friend the Illithid or Mind Flayer. It's going to have a high dexterity and a skill proficiency in stealth for sure. For the acid blood, I'm pretty sure there's a couple of creatures that already have this ability. A troll of some kind, maybe? Ah, yes, the venom troll. Poison, not acid, but that's pretty close. There might be something with acid blood, but I can't think what it is right now. Let me know in the comments if you know what it is. And of course it has its very deadly tail, so we'll make sure that it has an attack that uses that. Facehugger eggs might be something to consider if we want to flesh the creature design out with a layer. That could be really fun to build an encounter around, maybe for a future video. So I'm going to leave that for now. We've got more than enough to work with already. So to briefly touch on challenge rating before I get started, I wouldn't begin with it. It's much easier to calculate once you have completed the creature design and then to tweak it from there. So to begin with, I would just focus on making the creature you want to make and don't worry too much about the CR. So let's make the Xenomorph. I'm going to use the D&D Beyond builder just because it's convenient, but you could easily do this with pen and paper or whatever you want. I'm calling this the Xenomorph Adult because I might want to have an egg, a facehugger, larvae? Is that what that stage is called? And a queen at some point. Its size is going to be medium, about the same size as a person. In its special traits, we want to include things like its acid blood. So for now, I've lifted the Venom Troll ability Poison Splash and changed it to acid damage. Another fun thing we could do here is make non-magical weapons take cumulative penalties as the acid eats into them. Ooh, that's nasty. I like it. It's going in. If I remember rightly, the Xenomorph is also blind, right? It doesn't have eyes, so we want to give it keen hearing and smell and blind sight probably. It's quick and relentless when it attacks with its claws and its tail, so we'll give it multi-attack for sure in its actions, but it only ever really uses its tongue thing when its enemy is incapacitated. So let's say it can make either 2 claw attacks or a claw attack and a tail attack. I've given our Xenomorph a basic slashy claw attack, and I gave it a few different maneuvers it could use with its tail, either slashing with it, impaling an enemy to grapple them, or wrapping it around an enemy to both grapple and restrain them. This is important for its final attack, its deadly proboscis. I'm going to take some inspiration from the Mind Flayer's Extract Brain ability here. The Mind Flayer attack has the potential to immediately kill its target as it eats their brain. There's an obvious similarity there. Now this is clearly a very dangerous ability to give our Xenomorph, and if we look at the Mind Flayer, we can see that it requires that the target is incapacitated and grappled by the Mind Flayer. So there's a saving throw that the creature has to have failed before the Mind Flayer even has a chance to use Extract Brain. The Xenomorph doesn't really have a way to stun or otherwise incapacitate its foes, but it does only use its tongue attack on enemies it has grappled. By taking away the opportunity that the target has to make a save to avoid being targeted by this attack, we significantly increase the likelihood that someone will be hit by it. So we could attempt to mitigate that threat by reducing the damage done by the tongue attack. But when we see this happen in the source material, it's pretty much certain death if you get hit by it. So in this case, I'm going to leave it as it is, and bear that in mind when trying to determine the challenge rating of this creature. Something else to consider here is that compared to the Mind Flayer, the Xenomorph is more limited in its modes of attack. It can't blast enemies with psychic energy or cast psionic spells, so it's a little bit more exposed when it has someone grappled. I think this is justified in this case, but check it out for yourself. Let me know if you think it's too powerful or if you don't think it's powerful enough. Now we need to decide its ability stats, and again I recommend looking through the existing material to see if you can find a creature that has a similar physiology to the creature that you intend to build. In this case, the first thing that occurred to me was the Nyogi, another sort of insectoid alien thing. It is a CR3 creature, so possibly a bit weaker than we want, but it's a good place to start. This gives us a strength score of 6, a bit too low, we want to give that a boost. Dexterity of 16, that seems about appropriate. Constitution of 14, again, that seems about right. Intelligence of 13, enough for the Xenomorph to be an adaptive hunter, that's fine. Wisdom 12. This seems fine as well, but we could afford to boost it if we wanted to make our Xenomorph more of an effective stalker. Charisma 15. That's too high. Our Xenomorph really isn't the type to empathize or otherwise engage with other creatures, so it doesn't have the need of any high charisma. One quick thing that we could do is to switch this with the strength score. And the only other change that I made was to boost the wisdom up to 14. I've given the Xenomorph proficiency in dexterity saves, blind sight, and proficiency in perception and stealth. I've also given it immunity to acid damage because, well, acid blood. In order to calculate its armor class, I've considered a couple of things. How hard is it to hit, and how hard do you have to hit it to damage it? Thinking back to Godzilla, super easy to hit. There is no way you would miss Godzilla. However, he's pretty tough, so you'd have to hit him really hard for him to even feel it. The Xenomorph is sort of the opposite. It's quick and sneaky, so not terribly easy to hit, but it doesn't have much in the way of natural toughness, save for some sort of chitinous armor on some parts of its body. Godzilla, I think I'd put at about a 15 to hit, but make sure you had a whole heap of hit points. For the Xenomorph, we'll go for 17, I think. It's a little bit harder to hit, but if you do hit it, you'll definitely damage it. Plus, it will damage you with its acid blood! Next episode, I'll go into these calculations in a bit more detail, because they do just seem like arbitrary numbers, but this is already a pretty long video. In basic terms, you can think of AC in much the same way as we think of DC, with this same table to determine difficulty. From 5 being laughably easy to 30 being barely possible. Around this point in the process is when I would start to consider challenge rating. With the work we've done so far, we should have an idea of how difficult we want an encounter with a xenomorph to be. Could an average person kill one? No, probably not. So we know that they're not going to have a challenge rating below something like 1. If we consider Alien versus Predator, we can see that, no, actually, let's not. There are some things I just won't do. I'd say a party of 4 adventurers at around level 7 would have a tough time with a xenomorph. They would succeed in defeating it almost certainly, but 1 or 2 of them might come close to dying. So just as a first estimate, I'm going to say the xenomorph is CR7. With that number, we can save ourselves some work by looking at other creatures in that range and getting an idea of the appropriate health pools to hit scores and damage mods. These numbers, particularly health, can vary wildly, so I will also cover those more next time. My first version of the xenomorph ended up with the stats you can see here. I will link to it in the description so you can check it out for yourself. In the next video, we will look at some of the calculations used to determine CR, AC, and some other things in a bit more detail. We'll probably make some changes to our xenomorph based on that information, and we'll see how much our second version changes from the first. We'll also use that time to look at some of the classic D&D monsters, and I'll show you some techniques that you can use to make any monster easier or more difficult, and basically that challenge rating is a completely useless indicator. Shout out, of course, to C Von Rats for the request for today's video. Thank you kindly. Hopefully this was somewhat interesting or useful, and I will try to get to the rest of the points you mentioned in the next video. Keep your suggestions and requests coming. I'm always more than happy to make content about the things that you're interested in. Until next time, stay safe and happy adventuring. See ya. Water.